Okay. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. So, as Abu Muhammad, Brother Hisham, is often trying to convince me to do something here every month, I thought what would be beneficial, and I've been thinking about what would be beneficial for the community, inshallah, and what may not be provided by other people, and what is in my capacity, is to, inshallah, do probably once a month a review of a book. This book could be on this topic, like Sharia, or it could be political book or anything that I think is relevant and necessary for the community to be aware of and would be beneficial to go over. So inshallah we'll talk more, but hopefully hope to establish about once a month and giving a kind of overview of a book, talk about some critical ideas, and inshallah hopefully will be beneficial. So I vaguely remember reading Al-Muwafaqat many years ago, and it came to my mind to do this topic. Principally, there are a few different reasons. One is because you find, unfortunately, in the Muslim community at large around the world, a great deal of confusion over how people prioritize their lives. So, in other words, we have people fighting over and willing to kill each other over small things, and ignoring major matters, which would be, of the major crimes that are committed. And part of the reason, at least, is a failure to prioritize the ahkam al-shar'iyya, the actual what Islam prioritizes, and to even understand that there is a prioritization, that there is something that is more important and something that is less important, something which is derivative and secondary, and something which is primary, something which is the first rule that needs to be established, and something which is something that's secondary to that, and something that is secondary to that. And there is nobody more suited for this purpose to read than this book, Al-Muwafaqat fi Usul al-Shar'iyya, by Abu Ishaq Ibrahim ibn Musa al-Shatibi. And in fact, interestingly, so first I'll go over a little bit of the biography of Imam al-Shatibi. If you look at Shatibi, of course, this is a reference to a town in Spain. So he grew up in Andalusia. He was from that town, but also he was a resident of Granada, and so that was where he spent most of his time. If you go and look in Wikipedia about the town where he's from, you'll see that there's 20 people that are the most famous celebrities of that town. All of them are Jose this and Jose that. They're all Spanish names, except there's two famous people that we know, and they're both Shatibi, right? So of course, the people of Qira'ah will know Imam al-Shatibi, but that's a different Imam al-Shatibi. That's the one, he's from almost 100 years before him. But they are the two most famous among the celebrities of that town. They're listed in there, so alhamdulillah. We got that. Imam al-Shatibi, the one we are talking about, he died in the 790 of the Hijri calendar and 1388 of the common calendar, American calendar. You can think of him as the 8th century of Hijri or the 14th century Gregorian calendar. And of course, he grew up in Andalusia. He was, as was the general rule of the scholars of that area, he was a Maliki by training. He wrote this book, and in the book, actually, in the introduction, he has an interesting story about what is the nature of this book, why did he write this book, and he frames it as a discussion with a scholar of his that he was respected, and the scholar came to him and he said, I saw in a dream that this book you're working on, so he knew he was working on a book, he said that this book, in this book, I saw that you were reconciling the matters of Abu Hanifa and then the principal student of Imam Malik. So in other words, he was saying, in my dream I saw you reconciling the schools of the Maliki school and the Hanafi school. And that is why he actually named the book Al-Muwafaqat, the reconciliations between the different principles. He said, before that I was going to title this book Asrar al-Taklif, the secrets of obligation. And he changed his mind about the title after that that story or that interaction. We want to take a step back about what is he thinking about reconciling. And so to do that, you must understand usul al-fiqh itself in general. And usul al-fiqh, of course, has to be understood, and what is it compared to fiqh? So most of you, and some of you may know that, of course, but in many ways people say that it's a difference between theoretical physics and applied physics. The theory is usul al-fiqh, and the application is fiqh. So the first book that we have written, although usul al-fiqh goes before that we attach to usul al-fiqh is the Risala of Imam Shafi'i. And in fact, many people, one scholar I was heard talking about al-Muwafaqat, he said, what Muwafaqat is most resembling is al-Risala by Imam Shafi'i. Because of course, Imam Shafi'i, rahimahullah, he was studied in Mecca, then he studied in Medina with the Maliki school, and then he went to Iraq, and he had many famous debates with the Hanafi madhab as well. And so in his Risala, he tried to reconcile some of those principles. So, but after Imam Shafi'i, you see that usul al-fiqh, it became its own discipline, and it kept growing and growing and growing. And so one of the criticisms that Imam Shatibi had about usul al-fiqh in general was that there were many philosophical entries into this discipline that didn't have any practical impact on a person's life. They were became from the philosophers, from the people who were studying Aqidah, and they started entering into all sorts of theoretical aspects that didn't really lead to any practical ruling. And so he wanted to take a more broader view of what is knowledge. So, for example, this book starts with the idea of knowledge. What is knowledge? And in fact, he has a controversial view, which I haven't seen other places, where he says that well, actually, let me take a step back before I say that. One of the things about usul al-fiqh is that there's certain terminology that is obvious to anybody who studies it after a brief time. And that is this idea of certain and uncertain, qat'i or dhanni. And Imam Shafi'i, rahimahullah, he introduced this idea, although it may obviously precede him, but the idea is very well explained in the Risala, about the idea of something being certain and uncertain. And so there's a certainty and uncertainty in several different ways. There's a certainty in the actual transmission of the text. So for example, the Quran is qat'i. It's absolutely certain that it's the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there's no dispute about that. And on the other hand, the hadith literature has some of it which a large amount of people have transmitted, and which we call mutawatir, which is also in that same category of certain, qat'i. And there's other aspects of hadith which are single narration, one by one, and most of scholars will call that dhanni, because it doesn't amount to certitude. Um, and one of the ways to look at it, for example, is I don't know have anybody been to Mongolia? No. But do you believe that Mongolia exists? Yes. And why do you believe Mongolia exists? Because you know on the map there's Mongolia. You read in your history books there's Mongolia. There's a Genghis Khan who came from Mongolia. There's all this, you know. So there's overwhelming evidence for you, and that's absolutely certain that there is a place called Mongolia, right? But now let's say you meet a person from Mongolia and he says that, you know, I go to this town in Mongolia and down this road there's a certain apple tree and it has the best apple in the whole world. You said this person, maybe he's telling me the truth, I don't know, you know, he's one person, he's only one report. So this is the same difference between something that is certain and something that's dhanni. Even though that person is trustworthy, you believe what he's saying, but you know, it may not be true. It's one person saying one thing. And so that is traditionally how the scholars of usul, they talked about what is definite and what is indefinite. The second part is if the text is definite in its wording, meaning there can be no dispute about what this text is saying, and versus something that could be disputed, you could have multiple meanings, what they call mutashabihat also. And so things that the text itself and how it's worded could be qat'i and, you know, and so forth. So that's the traditional understanding of what is qat'i and dhanni. But Imam al-Shatibi, you know, what he did, and what is very unique here, is first of all, he said that usul al-fiqh itself is qat'i. Something that many people, is an odd statement. And the reason why he said it's definitive, the actual science of the basis of law, is that it is being applied to other definitive sources. In other words, you are applying usul onto the Quran, so shouldn't the usul also be definitive? Meaning you're applying it to a qat'i source, and you need a qat'i mechanism to understand that source. So it's something that it's kind of unique to his ideas, but that's the first thing that he starts the book with, actually. And then you go on, and he's talking about a new a concept which is not in Imam Shafi'i's Risala. It's called mutawatir ma'nawi. And he's saying that there is a kind of certitude that comes from meaning. Meaning that there could be, you know, many different hadith. And he gives the example of intention. So we know the hadith that the Bukhari starts with from Umar ibn al-Khattab radhiyallahu anhu, where he said, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى. If you indeed, for the actions are according to intentions, and for everybody is according to what they intended. But that hadith is khabar ahad. It is only by a single translation and a single chain. But he says that because the idea of intention, and that intention is important, because we have many other hadith that talk about the importance of intention, the importance of ikhlas and niyyah, the importance of and the connection between intention and where somebody ends up with, you know, with their actions, and that you have an overwhelming amount of these ahadith, so that the meaning becomes mutawatir ma'nawi. It becomes a definitive meaning. And so he says that we can establish usul al-fiqh, or any kind of definitive matter, by these definitive sources. So definitive meaning mutawatir in the Quran and mutawatir hadith, through meanings that are qat'i, or to a mutawatir, a different mechanism, which is mutawatir ma'nawi. And he rejected the idea that rational proof could be by itself a form of evidence for usul al-fiqh. He said that rational proof is always dhanni, and it cannot apply itself onto a definitive principle. So that is where he starts this book. And in fact, many people today, when they hear about Imam al-Shatibi, they start with maqasid al-shar'iyyah, the objectives of the law, the objectives of Islamic law. But in fact, the book is much more than that. So I'll talk a little bit about how the book is structured itself. So the book is basically in 4 parts. Kitab al-Ahkam is the first part. Kitab al-Maqasid is the second, then the Kitab al-Adilla, which is the book of evidences, and then Kitab al-Ijtihad. So there's four basic parts to the book: Ahkam, Maqasid, Adilla, and Ijtihad. So, and I'm going to focus on the first two parts for this talk. But so that is the general principle that he starts the book on. So one of the differences that's very unique about this book, and by the way, I didn't mention this book was lost basically. In the introduction of the English translation, the editor says that just because we teach something in Islamic schools or Islamic madrasas or so forth, it doesn't mean necessarily that what we're teaching is the more important thing, because sometimes some books like this have been lost over time. And in fact, this was published in 1888, I believe, 1884, yeah. So for many years it was lost, and in fact he gave the example of Imam al-Suyuti. Imam al-Suyuti, rahimahullah, he has many books, and in fact many of the scholars say, he took all these things from other scholars, some of the things, so he became the most popular writer, among the most popular writers, but it doesn't mean necessarily that all of his are the best books. And so this is what he was trying to underline. And so Imam al-Shatibi's book, Muwafaqat, became sort of unknown until published in Tunis in late 1800s, and it first became taught by the most famous scholar Ibn Ashur, Muhammad Tahir Ibn Ashur. And he's a Tunisian scholar and Shaykh al-Islam in his title, in his position. But he's the first person who started to revive the idea of teaching his book, and also the idea of maqasid al-shar'iyyah, the objectives of Islamic law. And then later on, we have Muhammad Rashid Rida, who is the most famous student of Sheikh Muhammad Abduh. And he started to really wholesale introduce parts of the book into his magazine Al-Manar, which became, obviously, it was popular, it was all over the Muslim world. So that's how this thing spread. And of course, we did a talk on Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, rahimahullah. He would often talk about al-Muwafaqat by name and talk about the very many principles that he got from that. Because, this is again, when you're thinking about the higher objectives and what is important and what is not important, this book is critical to trying to sort through that. So I just wanted to mention that part about its importance. Let's see, what time was it? 8:51. Okay, so one thing is that another aspect of this book is that Imam al-Shatibi, rahimahullah, he was very much against the idea of anything in the Sharia or in the sciences of Sharia being too much hypothetical, too much bound by philosophy. And what he meant by that is that he said, if you think about it realistically, Islamic law should be something that is applied. And how do you apply something as a person? Well, you have to know it. And how do you know it? It must be simple, it must be obvious. So this is one of the things that he mentioned, and he's mentioned from the Quran, وَالَّذِي بَعَثَ فِي الْأُمِّيِّينَ رَسُولًا مِّنْهُمْ. He said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said he sent a Rasul to the Ummiyin, to the unlettered people. And so Imam al-Shatibi, in his analysis of that, is that naturally whatever the Sharia comes with, it should be obvious to even the unlettered person, the person who has basic knowledge of Islam. If there's something so strange that it requires such a specialist and nobody else can understand it other than that specialist, then it becomes strange. And it no longer fits the category of something that is understood by the Ummiyin. And so that was very critical in how he approached this. The other thing that to understand about this book is traditionally usul al-fiqh is deductive. istinbat, as we say. It becomes, you extract a ruling, a hukm shar'i, from the sources. But in fact, Imam al-Shatibi introduced a different idea, which is type of inductive reasoning, looking at all of the sources together and where are they pointing in which direction. So rather than looking at an individual source necessarily, he was looking at the overall picture, and that's where the mutawatir ma'nawi comes from, because the idea is not just one hadith here and one hadith there and one hadith there. It's that where are all of these hadith, what is the general ruling that we can extract from them, and what is the meaning that is, if you look at them all together, it's the meaning that become most obvious. You can't escape that meaning. So that is something that he was also very much a principle that he was upholding. So he talked about the Islamic law as basically being three different levels. And he used the term, these are his terms, ضروريات, حاجيات, and تحسينيات. So on the highest level we have the essentials, what we call ضروريات. On the middle level we have حاجيات, the necessities. And on the third level we have تحسينيات, the complementary or the things that make something beautiful, the things that are additive to the other categories. And in that way he created a hierarchy. There's a top level, there's a middle level, and there's a bottom level. He said if the bottom levels, they cancel out the top level idea, then they're not valid principles. And I'll give you specific examples, inshallah. So among the dururiyat, he said there were also the 5 essential maqasid al-shar'iyyah. And of course, this idea didn't come from him, this idea of being their higher objectives of the law. This, of course, is originally explained by Imam al-Haramain al-Jawaini, rahimahullah. He was the principal teacher of Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah. And so they both outlined the idea of that the law itself has certain higher principles. And in those, there's, maybe I can ask somebody. Who knows the 5 principles? Maybe this might be obvious to some people. Anybody? حفظ الدين, حفظ النفس, حفظ المال, حفظ النسل, and we're missing one. So دين, مال, نسل. That's the 6th principle, if you add that. If you add that. There are 5 principles which are agreed upon. The 6th principle is what you mentioned. Nafs, mal, din, aqal, yes, of course. That's where we lost it here, aqal. So those are the 5 basic principles that are the higher objectives of the law: to guard your wealth, to guard your life, to guard your property, to guard your deen, and to guard your intellect. And there's a 6th one that what some people added, and there are actually 7 or 8. Other people have added other principles to it, so guarding your honor and so on. And there's some other principles, but these are the 5 that are most agreed upon. And of course, these didn't come from rational understanding. For example, the commandment for qisas, right? So that somebody, if you kill somebody, that you will be killed. Well, what is the reasoning? What is that preserving? It is preserving your life, right? And the same commandment for cutting off the hand of the thief, what is that preserving? It is preserving your property, and so on and so forth. So it's not that these things came out of nowhere. They came out of the basic principles that are absolutely certain from the Quran and the Hukm Shar'i. They're not indefinite principles. They're not rationalized. These are things that are coming from the evidences. So he said these are belonging in the Dhururiyat category. And it's better if I consult my my notes because this part is actually quite complicated. So first of all, all of these things are the ahkam shari'ah. They're all focused on four different categories itself. So first of all, we have ibadat, so worship. We have adat, which are things of natural a human being would do, eating and clothing and so forth. We have mu'amalat, which are transactions, human transactions, like a business and your profession, things of that nature. And the fourth one, maybe nobody will get, I don't know. Fourth one, anybody? Jinayat. So jinayat, which is a defensive preservation. It's sort of like you have a speed limit to prevent a car accident. So there's a punishment to prevent something else. For example, and I'll give you an example of dhururiyat from the higher principles. So if we think about now, we're thinking about what is higher and what is lower and what is lowest, right? And so, for example, the obligatory prayers, the salawat al-khamsa, these are from the dhururiyat, and in the category of ibadat, right? If we get a category of adat, it would be that you need to eat. Obviously, to preserve your life, you have to eat, and there's no way around that. From mu'amalat, it would be certain basic human transactions like sale. Without sale, you can't have a society that's natural. And so and so forth. These are the basic sort of essential elements. So then we go to hajiyat, and he defined this as these are things that were required to attain facility and remove constraints leading to difficulty and hardship and loss of the desired object. They are some things that facilitate the top level. They help it happen. So for example, in ibadat, you have exemptions for travel, right? So when you're traveling, you can combine your prayer, you can shorten your prayer, things of that nature. These are not essentials in the sense that, the salah is the essential, the top level. This serves salah, right? It becomes to allow the prayer to continue. So it's a lesser level. And in the same category, tahsiniyat would be in the same category of ibadat. So something that it's an acquisition of good things from practices and avoiding deception and obnoxious things by. So it's something that tahsiniyat is if you do it, it is something that is from good morals, from good character. And it's something that people who would obviously have a reasonable temperament would consider obnoxious. That's what you want to avoid. So for example, in ibadat, tahsiniyat, he gave the example of seeking nearness through charity. So giving sadaqah in ibadat, you're generally required, as zakat is from the top level, but general sadaqah, and when you do it, you get more, you become more perfect in your character. Same thing, let's look at adat. So in hajiyat, if you look at adat, it is like enjoying good things that are lawful. So in other words, you can, like clothing or animals or anything that's lawful, no today's parlance, you have a nice car, it's lawful, and that's fine. And then if you go to the next level, it's like the etiquettes of eating. In other words, you eat with your right hand. These are not of the higher level principles. And you can see naturally why this is necessary for us today to think about. Is because some people over the small matters like this of the tahsiniyat, they're willing to fight you or abuse somebody, which is a higher level principle. So they don't understand the fact that there are these levels in the Sharia. So just a few more examples. So obviously mu'amalat, we talked about sale, but in hajiyat he said there's qirad, which is profit sharing. He gave an example. Or in tahsiniyat, if we have the same in mu'amalat, it becomes the prevention of sale of impure things. So in other words, you're selling something, but you know your product is not really that good. You know, you know it. You know you sell garbage, but it's not like something that's not allowed. You know, it's like a junk, but you could sell something better, and you could advertise it and tell people more obviously that what it is, but you don't, and people buy it and so forth. But it's not from the higher level of sale, because there's some deception involved. So when you hold yourself to a higher character in terms of your sales, and you sell the highest thing, and you're the most honest, and people are happy with their purchases, then that becomes something from tahsiniyat. In other words, the other person who's selling, we can't say that person is is doing something haram. He's not doing anything out of the ordinary, but this person is obviously a better business. You can see, this person has a much more well-run business, and people who are satisfied when they buy something from him. So from the jinayat category, among the hajiyat, they said that it's liability for craftsmen. So in other words, when somebody, you make something and it's defective, so that becomes from the hajiyat. And from the tahsiniyat, it's from the jinayat, it's prevention of killing women in combat. And in fact, all of the tahsiniyat, they said the ethics of Islam could be in the tahsiniyat, and all the ethical principles. So from this, we have a kind of categorization of all of the Sharia. And one of the things that he said is that if, for example, there is an underlying principle, meaning one of the principles from the hajiyat or the tahsiniyat, which destroy the overarching principle, meaning, like, let's say, protection of life, if suddenly something from the lower category is implemented and it no longer serves the higher category, then it's eliminated. It's not even considered. So that's another way to look at any law. Is it serving the higher category or not? And if it's violating that basic higher principle, then it can no longer be part of Sharia. And so other things you can think about how you look at this. For example, preservation of life is the highest category. Below it, you have food, which is not allowed, right? So eating, for example, dead animals, right? But when life is at risk, what are you? Now you're allowed to eat from the dead animals, because that principle of not eating from a dead animal is from a lower category. It's from the hajiyat, not from the higher category of preservation of life. So now again, another example of how he looked at it. So in the same way, salah, we have the 5 daily prayers. He said that below that is the Jum'ah prayer. He said the Jum'ah prayer, if somebody abandons it 3 weeks in a row, then we do not accept the testimony of that person. His shahada is not accepted. But it doesn't from the same category as the higher level. And in fact, below that, even if so, let's say you have some of the principles upon which you have to pray. So for example, proper clothing when you're praying. But let's say it's the time of prayer and it's going to elapse, and then now prayer is going to be lost, then the higher principle has to be upheld. So you still pray in proper clothing if that's the only method you have to pray. So again, these ideas are very important to understand, and they're important to learn more about. I'm not a scholar of Sharia, don't think that. I'm just a reader of books. So, and somebody who can help you, because I've listened to other shuyukh about this, but it's the encouragement here is to think about what are the higher purposes of Islamic law, and how do we organize ourselves in terms of serving the Sharia properly, and how do we avoid these kinds of mistakes where we are the derivative principles. The lower principles are overriding the higher principles of Islamic law. The other basic idea, and of course there are many ideas in this book. This book is voluminous. There's every paragraph you have to reread 10 times to understand some of what he's trying to say. Some of the things he says are frankly unique, and maybe some of them are controversial, because in fact he talks about Sharia, but he uses Sharia as a term which nobody else would use it. He included all of knowledge into Sharia, including astronomy, including medicine. He said so some of his terminologies, if you read them carefully, you'll be a little confused. But the other one of the other major things he talked about is maslaha and interest. And this is an important topic, and I think I'll end on this topic, inshallah. And the idea of interest, or maslaha, is that by the time of Imam Shatibi, rahimahullah, in usul al-fiqh, it was generally agreed upon that the Sharia itself is for the maslaha of the human being. Meaning that the Sharia, Islamic law, is by definition for the benefit of the human being. And if you unpack that idea, you'll see that a few things are true. One is, how do we know what is beneficial? So number one, we have to go back to Islamic law. We have, I was listening to a lecture by Sheikh Al-Bulti the other day, and he was talking about some people say that benefit comes from rational reasoning. But in fact, he said benefit is from whatever the Sharia says is beneficial and whatever the Sharia says is not beneficial. So this is what Imam Shatibi is saying. And I have actually an excerpt that I think I will read about this matter. But basically he's saying this, that the maslaha has to be derived from the Sharia itself and not from rationality. He gave this statement. He says that some people say that the interests of the hereafter, meaning the akhirah, cannot be known except through Sharia. He's saying this is a person who says this, not what he's saying. So just be careful. But as for the worldly matters, these are known through necessity, experience, practices, and probabilities. As for the compatible interests and injuries, distinguish the preferred from the others, they must. So how do you, in the worldly matters, how do you figure out what is better or worse? Well, you subject it to your reasoning, on the grounds that the person who gave Islamic law did not intend harm, and so any kind of reasoning that you have in your mind that this is beneficial and this is harmful, then that is where Sharia is found, except for the things that affect the akhirah or the hereafter, because those things are unknown. You have to get them from the Sharia itself. So Imam Shatibi says about this statement, he says, as for what he said about the hereafter, it is as he stated, meaning that we cannot understand what is good for us in the hereafter except by what is revealed to us. As for the other worldly matters, it is so in certain cases and not in others. It is for this reason that the Sharia came down in different periods. It explained the position of the people of the period and how they had deviated from the straight path. So in other words, it is obvious from the Quran, when you read it, that rules came down continuously by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the people. If they knew what was in their best interest, then these rules would not have come. They could have derived them. And in fact, the rules keep coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to return people to what is most beneficial to them. And it should be obvious to anybody in this society that people have come up with all sorts of ideas, to help them and benefit them. And in fact, many of those lead to their destruction. the highest rates of suicide in the world, or mental illness, these, because it came through a process of human reasoning where they looked for what was most beneficial. So that's what Imam Shatibi is saying, is that as for what this guy was saying, that you can find the maslaha, the interest, through rationality in this world, he said this is not necessarily the case. Sometimes it's true and sometimes it's not. So again, he said, if this was true in an absolute sense, the Sharia would not have adduced proofs for those things that are not belonging to the hereafter. The Sharia came down to establish the affairs of this world and the next, not just one of them. And the Sharia undertook the taking of transactions and terminated many avenues of corruption. And the human situation makes it difficult to grant independence to reason to assess all interests and harm. And the exception, and this is the last point that I think is worthwhile to unpack, is making the statement that the identification of interests and harms is attained through experience after the Sharia has laid down its principles. So once you have the principles of the Sharia, now you can operate under the Sharia, and now you can use your experience. Now you can see what works in agriculture, what works in business and commerce, as long as you have the guidelines to follow from the Sharia, so you don't sway in too far in one direction or another. And he said, if somebody says that is the role of reason, then he would agree with that. So in other words, reason has to be restrained by revelation, and revelation should be obvious, should be clear, and it should be not something that's hidden or secret or something that's, he said, in fact, he criticized the Shia in this book as well, the Batiniya, because the Batiniya say, what did they say? Something is secret. There's a secret meaning. There's not just this is the normal meaning of the text, but there's a secret meaning. It's only known by our Sheikh. He said this is ridiculous, because this book came for the unlettered people, and they have to know this by necessity when they read this, what is true and what is obvious, and that is the meaning that we need to take from the text. So I'm going to end with that. I hope that sort of gives you a flavor of this book. The book obviously is much deeper than this. There's many other aspects to it, but these, the principles or the higher objectives of the law is why people refer to this book, but it has a lot more to talk about how to think about Islamic law globally, and not just on the basis of a single narration hadith. In fact, many people, they read Bukhari, they read one hadith, and they come and start to, bother the sheikh or the imam about this or that hadith. And the fact is that they didn't understand the overall principles of this deen, and they're trying to use like a single narration hadith to without any kind of global comprehension about what Islam is about. And that is something that, again, Imam Shatibi was very much against. And of course, any imam, when they're faced with that, they will obviously reject and criticize. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله العظيم سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك واجعلنا من الذين يستمعون القول ويتبعون أحسنه. So I'll open any questions. I don't, or any comments, Brother Shem. Yeah, Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashur. I actually, the one who wrote the famous tafsir is who I'm talking about. But I don't know if you're talking about the father. You think he was the one? Tahrir wa Tanwir. I thought you were talking about his dad, not him. I was listening to a scholar who mentioned it, and I read some of his texts. I know that the son, he definitely talked about these topics. I don't know about the father, so maybe you know more than I do. Yeah. Because the son died in the 70s. Oh, okay, yeah. Sorry, then it is the father. 1887. Yes, exactly. Yeah, 1887. He was born, and he preceded. For example, Sheikh Sheikh Muhammad Abduh was 1900. Ibn Ashur is before that. So, the father, yes. The other question that whenever you hear, of course, in the US and Europe, Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point. So, what Hisham was saying is that in the modern day, people take Imam al-Shatibi and they take him to a direction where he didn't ever went to. You know, they just abuse and the poor fellow with his ideas. And they take this, first of all, there's a idea in the Maliki madhab of maslaha al-mursal, which is, you know, a maslaha which doesn't have necessarily a clear textual there's a gap in the text, not that it's a direct text, but you have to have some indirect indications of this benefit from the Sharia itself. But Imam al-Shatibi, as we said, you know, he rejected the idea that you can use your mind to come up with, you know, whatever is beneficial for you. You know, this is, he said, this is actually out of bounds from, if you look at the Quran and itself, it doesn't make any sense. In fact, the Sharia is there to guide you. But once you're in the Sharia in terms of the general guidance, now you can have some of your own intellect to, for example, as Imam Shafi'i said, you know, find the direction of the Qibla. We know the Quran tells us to pray in the direction of the Qibla, but now we need to find the direction. Well, now you need to use your reason and find the best way to do that. So Jazakallah khair for that. Yes, the comment is that maslaha became, you know, the higher level, but actually that maslaha serves the higher level because you have to know that the higher level is revelation. It has to be qat'i in certainty in the principles before you can advance maslaha past that. In fact, Imam al-Shatibi talks about the idea of maslaha and mafsada. Maslaha is the interest, mafsada is harm, or and that some people, he says, will claim that that the harm of a basic thing, like for example, if you pray, there's a certain hardship that comes from that. It's not like zero energy. You're burning 300 calories in Salat al-Tarawih, for example, you know, as many people have said. So there's a certain expenditure of energy. And it's true for any category that there's some kind of maybe a harm mixed in with it. It's not like, you know, you can find anything that's perfectly beneficial by just looking at it, you know, purely. But he says that kind of mafsada in the ibadat and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded is not really mafsada. It's like the medicine. You know, the medicine is bitter, but it's meant to cure the disease. So there's that bitterness of the medicine is not really a mafsada. It's not really a harm, but some people look at it as a harm. But in fact, it's just the necessity of getting the cure. And so that's what many people unfortunately misunderstand about this idea also, that there can't be any, you know, negativity in the maslaha. But no, that's not the case. It's often mixed. He said it's often mixed together like that. Any other questions, comments? No. All right, well, anybody has any book ideas? You know, you guys want any books we can review? We can, inshallah, pick those up. But I have my own ideas, so inshallah, we'll see how far we get before Ramadan. Inshallah.